Welcome back, Breakaway Wealth. I'm your host, Jim Oliver, and with me today is my special guest, Brent Sprenkle. Brett.
Thanks for having me on, Jim. Excited to be here today.
Yeah, I there's two things I always look for. One is when I'm looking for a book, I love something that catches my eye. And then when I'm also looking for a book, I want something that's kind of recent because let's face it, we've had a lot happen in the last year. And if somebody's writing a book that was written, and by the way, I love classic books, but if it was 10 years ago on a practical, how-to book, then wait a minute, did you foresee us having this pandemic and all these other consequences, right? But your book just came out in January, and tell everybody what the name of your book is.
$1 Billion Portfolio is the name of the book, Jim.
$1 Billion Portfolio. And I know that all of my real estate people that are listening right now just turned up the volume and stopped doing what they were doing while they were going to listen, because let's face it, if you're in real estate, who wouldn't want to have $1 billion portfolio?
That is the goal. Most people, when they start acquiring real estate, they try to set a goal for where they want to be. Some of the people set $1 billion as their benchmark for success. And that's a lofty goal, but there's a lot of people that have far exceeded that. And they've done it very easily and quickly, some of them. Some of them, it took them 30, 40 years. Some did it in 5. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, Brent, but tell everybody a little bit about your journey to get into real estate and why you wrote the book, and just kind of a little bit about your background. You're in California, in El Segundo.
I live in the Los Angeles area. Yes, I live in Manhattan Beach. Office is in El Segundo. I grew up in Pennsylvania and decided that I wanted to be an engineer when I was in high school. So went to college to get an engineering degree, and out of college wound up getting recruited to work on satellites out here in El Segundo for Hughes aircraft, or Hughes Space and Communications to be specific. So they brought me out here. I was working on DirecTV satellites in the late 90s. I wound up getting laid off. A lot of that was because I turned out I was not a very good engineer. I didn't feel very challenged, and I got very complacent, and I think they realized that, and they did me the best favor anybody could have done, which was showing me the door, and that forced me to have to make a business decision. Good friend of mine, Kenny, had acquired a few apartment buildings back in the foreclosure era in the late 90s, and I just watched his success at a very young age and thought, geez, I'd love to buy some apartment buildings, but how do I do that? I have zero money. And Kenny suggested get into brokerage, because a lot of the brokers I've met are not very sharp and they're making great money, and you've got something working between your ears, so you could be able to do really well. So looked in the LA Times newspaper and saw an ad for commercial real estate brokers. And their requirement was, do you have a car? Can you get a real estate license? And are you willing to work for free? And I said yes to all 3 of those questions, and wound up getting a job, busting my rear end for a year and a half before I started to make any money. And those were some very challenging, depressing times, but started to make money, and real quickly realized that as a salesman, you can make really great money. You can make a lot of money, which you just pay taxes on. And it's kind of like that hamster on that wheel, right? You just keep running and running and running. And the minute you quit running, you're out of the game. So realized real quickly that the clients of mine that were so wealthy did it because they bought these apartment buildings or shopping centers or office buildings, and they weren't the sexiest investments. It always seemed that they overpaid for the properties when they bought them. There was never any bargains. But over the long run, rents grew and the properties appreciated to the tune of 10, 20% a year. And they'd refinance, pull money out, and go buy a new Ferrari. I mean, these guys were doing extremely well with one of the simplest, oldest investments in the world. And they took chances and risks buying them, but it worked out. And over the last 20 years, I've worked with some just rags to riches stories that were absolutely mind-blowing. And people would ask me, you worked with this guy, Bob. He's got this insane $1 billion portfolio. How did this guy do it? What did he do? And I just had so many people ask me these questions about clients of mine. I just thought, you know what? I should write a book about this because these people I've worked with really are fascinating. And their stories are amazing because if they did it, truly anybody could do it. And that was the inspiration for this book. It's not about me and what I've done. It's about these clients of mine and the success that they've had and how others can do the same exact thing. Is replicable.
Yeah, I love that. I love also what you just said, and that you echoed in the book, is the stories are really how fast somebody is done. Like, how fast have you seen somebody go from zero or close to zero, it doesn't have to be zero, to $1 billion?
In the book, I highlighted a guy named Keith Wasserman from a company named Gelt. He's in his 30s. When he was 20 some years old, they started buying foreclosed apartment buildings up in Bakersfield, which is kind of an inland agriculture oil city in California. And at first they bought these, I think they bought a few with this money from their credit cards. I mean, it was unbelievable how they did it. And then they brought investors in because the investors saw how successful they were. And now these guys have a massive national portfolio from Los Angeles all the way out to the East Coast. And it's worth well over $1 billion. And he's in his 30s. He doesn't own 100% of the real estate. He has investors in all of it, but the portfolio is valued at that. And he's very entrepreneurial, and he now has other businesses he's doing. It's mind blowing what people can accomplish if they have a business plan, a goal, and find a way to execute on it. And more importantly, how to bring investors in afterwards.
Yeah, one of the quotes that you have in your book from Keith, he said, "You can never have enough. I love what I do. I love making money. I love making my friends money. And this business is a safe way to make and preserve wealth."
Yeah.
And I love that because, he's saying, I love to make money. I also like to serve others and show them how to make money, or make money with them or for them in a safe way, and then also preserve that wealth. So, again, not very many people listen to this podcast, but we're told, give our money to somebody else, let them manage it for us. And then that our goal is to work for 20, 30, 40 years and then, quote, retire. And I live in Southwest Florida, so I see this every day, is that, retire, do nothing, play golf, and just float into the, and wait till you don't wake up the next day. I mean, it just sounds like such a depressing business plan, a life plan.
It's not a business plan. It's just how you end. It's how you go off into the sunset.
Yeah.
But some people can do that. There's some people that are perfectly fine with that. That's probably 80% of the population. But 20% of the population, they need some challenge in their life. They need a purpose. They wake up in the morning. If they don't have something they have to accomplish that day, they're just a mess. I think that's you. I think that's me. But 80% of the population, I think, is perfectly fine retiring at 55, 60, 65 and hanging out at the golf course all day, watching the reruns and going to dinner at their favorite restaurant that they eat at 3 times a week. I mean, a lot of people are comfortable with that.
Yeah. That you're exactly right. Some of the people that I know that are retired, it's almost like they want to brag about how old they were when they retired. Right. And what I always want to talk about is financial independence, because we don't really want to retire. We want to do what we want to do when we want to do it, regardless of what that is. Right. And but when I see somebody, there's actually was a study done, I can't remember the details, but it showed that people that retired at 55 versus 65 actually died sooner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you have no purpose in your life, you're going to wind up going real fast. I featured a client in my book. He's no longer alive, but his name is Henry Weiss. And the guy was in his 80s. And I remember him stopping into my office. Guy owned like hundreds of apartment buildings. And he's like, "Brent, what do you have for sale?" And at that point, I was still in my 20s. And
Yeah.
Mr. Weiss, like, why? Why do you want to keep buying buildings? He's like, "My doctor told me I need to keep something, something to keep me busy." And I just thought, okay, well, I guess this is giving him a purpose in life. This is keeping him alive.
Yeah.
And he lived another 4 or 5 years. But I thought this is probably the only thing this guy has going. He has no hobbies. There's nothing else of any interest in his life except acquiring real estate. Doesn't want to manage it, doesn't want to deal with it once he buys it. He just likes finding deals. It's the sort of the art of the hunt,
Yep.
the chase. He just loved that. And a lot of people do. They just search for the next deal. That's how they get their kicks. That's what gets them excited, is searching for the next thing to do. It's this hunter-gatherer approach. Obviously, these guys are hunters. And
Yeah.
there's other people that are gatherers. There's the Indians or the cowboys and the sheriffs, as we call it in our business. And he's the cowboy, and the sheriff sits there and does all the bookkeeping and pays all the bills, and he's out there just wrangling the cattlemen. So it depends on what you want to do and what your mindset is and how you're wired internally, I guess.
Yeah, no, I love that. I always tell my guys that my resignation will be in my obituary. So that because I always think to your point is, if I was a professional golfer, which I love to golf, when would I want to retire? I would want to retire when I was 85 or 95 or whatever.
You'd want to retire when you can't swing a club anymore, man.
That's right. When I can't swing a club anymore. And by the way, I know guys that are 85 and 90 that can still play pretty good.
Yeah.
But so I love that. So okay, because I really think that if you're in real estate, you should read this book, and I think you're going to get some nuggets out of this, some examples, some motivation of people that have done it. And just like you said, if they can do it, why can't I? Tony Robbins always says, if you want something, find out somebody else that's done it, find out what they did and do that. Right. But one of the things that I think people get hung up on is your first chapter. And it's, what do you want to buy? Right. Because everybody's got an opinion. Should it be mobile home park? Should it be storage? Should it be multifamily? Should it be, does it have to be in this part of the country or that part of the country? Or, this is a bad market. Talk a little bit about what you've seen and what you've helped your clients do to get off that first step.
So this is always one of the most interesting, complicated questions. And for a living, I still broker apartment buildings. That's my 9-to-5 job. And every now and then I get a call from somebody who says, "Hey, Brent, I was recommended to you. I've got X amount of money in the bank and I want to get into the business. What do I buy? Do I buy an apartment building? Do I buy a shopping center? Do I buy industrial?" I don't know how to answer that question. It's kind of like saying, what kind of a wine should you try? I don't know. They're all commercial investments. So my general answer to that is, what are they comfortable with? Did they live in an apartment when they were younger? Do they still live in an apartment? Do they work in an office building? Do they have any involvement at all in commercial real estate at all, even if it's just they go to an office during the day to work at their 9-to-5 job, and they kind of understand how things go? And are they interested in that business? But the reality is, you have to start small. There's no like small office buildings really, or there's a couple of them. You maybe try one of those. There's a lot of small apartment buildings out there, duplexes, fourplexes. But I think that's why most people get started buying apartment buildings, because they own a house and eventually they buy another house and they rent the old one out, or they buy a duplex. They're small investments and they're not that risky. So that's why most people start out buying residential real estate as their income commercial real estate investment. So that's typically the answer, is buy a small apartment building. But if they have access to small office buildings, small shopping centers, it's not a terrible way to go. But if you have a small office building with 3 tenants and one of them goes empty, you can't fill it up overnight. It could be ugly for 6, 12, 24 months. So that's why that's sort of a riskier investment. That's really more for a seasoned investor. So I typically tell people that if they're just going to start out with a small property to buy as their first thing, even just a rental house, just something to get the idea of renting a property, collecting rent, maintaining it, getting a mortgage, doing all that for something that's not your primary residence. It's always a good way to get your foot in the door. Plus, you can sell it easily and do a 1031 exchange and go buy something else. If you decide you don't like the idea of doing rentals for housing, then sell it, go buy something else. You'll figure out a way to do it. But if you don't get started somewhere, you're never going to get started. There's no perfect deal. You got to get your feet wet. You got to buy something.
Yeah, doctors are doctors before they're specialists, right? So, I remember when I was in my 20s and I read some real estate books and I didn't take any action part of it was I was convinced that, well, I couldn't paint this wall if I had to make it look halfway decent. Or I like to make this joke. It's not a joke, but my wife wanted to hire a plumber to replace some toilet seats because she was sure I couldn't do it. Okay, so that shows you my mechanical ability, and it's not far off from her perception. But what I realized is that when I got my first few rental properties, is I didn't do any of that. I had a property manager, paid them. I think I negotiated it to 8%. I think it started at 10, and they did all of that. They did all of the accounting. They did everything. They just, this was back in the day. They just sent me a check every month.
Isn't that great?
And I went, I could do this. I just need more checks.
Yeah.
Right. And so what I love about that is two. So there's one excuse like, hey, I got to manage this. I got to do this. No, you don't. Right. And you talk about that in the middle chapters of the book. I don't remember exactly the chapter, but you also talk about once you figure out what you want to buy, then it's kind of like, then there's the game begins, right? How do I get the money to buy it? Could I get the seller to finance part of it? All of those games, right? Can I do some math with the seller to show them that, hey, they really would be better off to finance it for me, because banks make money. I mean, that's why they're one of the nicest buildings in every town. So if you're going to be my bank, would you do that? Right? I want you to finance 100% of it. You want me to finance, you want to finance 50% of it or whatever it is. And we come to a number somewhere in between. But you talk about in the second chapter, kind of, you start to talk about that money. Talk a little bit about some of the inventive ways, or maybe somebody that started with nothing and didn't have any money to put in, some creative ways that they made it work.
Well, you have to start out with something. These buy with nothing down.
That's
tables. I mean, that's mythical things that happened maybe back in the 1950s. It doesn't work anymore. So, and I specifically put this in the book. This is not how to buy your first deal. This is how to take your first deal and buy your second. So, I mean, most people, if they haven't already, they should at least buy a house or a condo or something to live in. And then after a few more years, maybe they buy a larger house. And what do they do with the old one? If they have the means, they can keep that one rented out for a few years and then sell that, do a 1031 exchange and go buy a larger property. If they have a good source of income, then they have money in their savings and they can go out and buy additional properties. But the oldest trick in the book is just exchanging or refinancing and taking the refinance proceeds and buying another property. Those are obviously the two things that most people do, but all these guys with billion-dollar portfolios all at some point brought investors in, whether it was their uncle, their brother, coworker in the office, their dentist. I mean, they brought somebody in. A lot of them just found these investors by just talking to people. People find out about your deals that you do because people talk about the stocks that they buy. The people love to talk about that stuff. Oh, I bought Amazon for 80 and now it's selling for $350,000 a share. Well, I mean, whatever. But if you tell somebody you bought a little apartment building for $500,000 and 3 years later you sold it for 1.2, that's like, wow. Next time you buy an apartment building, let me know. Maybe I'll, give you some money. I was going to go buy some Apple stock, but it seems super overvalued. So maybe I'll give you some money. Next thing you know, they've got 2 or 3 people who want to go in on their next deal. And they get a phone call or they see an ad in the paper for a deal that they like. And they've got some investors lined up and woohoo, they're just syndicated a deal. And that's, once you do a couple of those things, you kind of get the fever for it. And that's going to become probably your full-time career. And next thing you know, you're going to have this massive portfolio. And your investors are going to tell their friends and they're going to tell their friends. Next thing you know, you got a couple hundred people that want to give you, money to go buy the next property. And you're going to have to start turning people down. Of course, at some point, the market will change and you can't get people these same yields and returns they were previously getting. But that's just the nature of the beast in anything you're doing.
Yeah. You know what? I like what you said. And I'm glad you clarified that, because I thought my question I didn't want it to be the no money down question. What I meant more was
Right.
what you said there at the end is, even if I don't have enough money to go buy a 100 door multifamily property, I bet that there are other people that want to buy the same type of thing. So if I don't have any money at all, what I would get really good at is finding properties and doing the due diligence and showing somebody why here's how we're going to, this is how this property is going to work, and here's how we're going to make money. Because the next step that you put in there, and I love that you put this in the beginning of the book, is that equity. Just like you said, in California, and I lived in Colorado for 20 years, you have a lot of ups and downs in the real estate pricing, right? So when you buy a property, it goes up, you have equity, use the equity to go buy something else, or create equity by improving the property, right? I mean, like you say somewhere in the book, and I don't remember where it's at again, I'm sorry, but you said something like, that's a simple old game, but it still works, right? And
Yeah, I mean, you still own the real estate. I mean, the trick is not to squander the refi proceeds, and a lot of people do.
right.
That's really what happened in the subprime meltdown. Is you had these people that bought a $300,000 house and they got a $340,000 loan to buy it. And also they own a house, they got 40 grand of cash, and they're like, wow, this is great. That's $40,000. I'm going to go buy a new SUV.
Yeah.
And then, a year later, like, I'm going to go buy another house. I mean, I wouldn't call him a friend, but someone I knew who lived in Vegas and bought like 10 houses that way. And of course,
Yeah.
he lost every single house he got foreclosed on. Lost every house.
Yeah.
And I think the moral of the story here is, if you're going to get high leverage loans, you better not squander all the money. You better put it into a safe investment and do something logical with it, because that's how you keep growing your empire. That's how you protect yourself from the rainy day. I mean, it will come. There will be a down cycle. It happens. We thought it was going to happen a year ago when COVID kicked in. It turned out it kind of did the opposite. But that could be, a variety of things, including them lowering interest rates and sending everybody billions of dollars worth of stimulus checks.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is, you just have to be smart. If you buy a building for $1 million, a couple years later it's appraised at 1.4, and you can refinance it and pull $250,000 out, what are you going to do with that money? You should go put it, reinvest it into a new deal, spend some of that money fixing up the property you refinanced, and that's something people neglect to do. You pull that money out, maybe go spend $25,000, $50,000 on infrastructure in that building, put a new roof on it, fix some windows, fix some plumbing issues, improve the property. Because the last thing you want to do is just milk the thing of some equity and not improve it and leave it worse off. So it's important that you go back and reinvest in your own properties periodically, but also keep growing your investments by buying more and more and more. This is how people become quote unquote slumlords, is because they're just focused on buying the next deal, and they're not really focused on management and keeping up the properties they already bought. So those properties fall into negligence. So it's just a different mentality. Some people just refuse to do it. They pay the price later down the road, but some people, their attitude is they're going to buy a building, keep it for 3 years and sell it. So they're not going to spend $1 on it during those 3 years, because they're just going to sell the property anyways. What's the point of putting a brand new roof on? Well, I'm only going to keep it for 3 years. That's not my approach, but there's people out there that all they do is they buy and sell. Their investors make huge returns. They pay taxes on them mostly. But if that's their business plan, so be it. It's different if you're buying with your own money or a couple investors, and you're buying with the plan, the goal of keeping the properties for 10, 20 years. At that point, you're forced to really maintain the properties, upgrade them, which makes it a little bit more challenging to keep reinvesting and buying new properties. But you just have to be disciplined, put things in writing about what you're going to do and how you're going to spend the money, and just try to be prudent about that. But at the same point, you have to be aggressive about looking for your next deal constantly.
Yeah, I like that. I've always been a cash flow guy, so I'm always just looking for things that I'm going to keep, especially in today's interest rate environment. I want to lock in, and I just want cash flow. I want more and more and more cash flow, because something that I learned from Robert Kiyosaki a long time ago was I could have a, $15 million house as long as I have other assets that are paying for it. And I don't have to go out and, and make the money to pay for my house. But I remember when I loaned the equity in our primary house one time to a business partner at like 15%. And when I did the math, it paid the payment. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, I just need a bigger loan and I'll have as big a house as I want, and then I kind of evolved into, okay, now I need an asset like real estate to do that same thing because it grew and everything else. So, but when I look at real estate and I look at all of the advantages, and you touched on this, but the tax advantages and everything else, depreciation, accelerating the depreciation, 1031 exchanges, and it's really, you got to learn that game. And I would just tell you, Brent, I would tell everybody they should read your book because it gives you, it's a roadmap on what you need to do. You could go, it's okay, these are the steps. Now you got to go out and do the steps, and you got to find the right people and everything else. And you even say that, but then you give an example of people that have done it and some examples of their success. And so I think it's motivating and it's a system all at the same time. So I applaud you on the structure of the book. It's really cool the way that you put it together.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So, I love your enthusiasm for real estate. I love that you live in Manhattan Beach. Now, again, I think I told you before we started recording, I haven't been back, but I used to between El Porto and the pier and 26 and through there, I used to try to surf. I was not very good at it. Okay. But there, I would only get like I only had a couple of dollars every day, and I'd go from like 6 to like 4 o'clock in the afternoon sometimes. And right above the pier was a little place called Zeppi's Pizza.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's still there, but
yeah, they changed the name. It's called like Manhattan Pizzeria or something like that.
Is that what it is? And I'll tell you what, that I would not have survived some of those days without Zeppi's Pizza and their 75-cent slice or whatever it was back in the day.
The good old days. Yeah. I think it's like my kids go down there. I think it's like $4 a slice now.
That's funny.
It's got a little more money.
Yeah. Well, Manhattan Beach, and like I said, Manhattan Beach is I live in Florida. I live close to the water, and my wife's from Florida. But I tell her, honey, there's the waves and the beach and the sunsets in California. It's tough to beat. But all right, Brent. So I really appreciate all of your advice. I always like to ask people a couple of questions. The first one is, if you could only retain the knowledge from one book that you've read, what would it be?
I love this question. And I always tell people that the book that to me really made the most difference, it's not a real estate book. It's just good old Dale Carnegie's, Making Friends, Influencing People.
Love it.
Human communication skills are the most important thing. And when I got into this business as an engineer, I struggled with being able to really communicate with people. It was just from my engineering background and couldn't relate to people, and just phone calls, conversations were just horribly awkward. And at some point, someone sat me down and said, you need to read this book and you need to just kind of warm up a little bit and just listen to people and ask questions and just be more engaging by really asking them about their lives. So that really helped. And I try to go back every couple of years and reread it, as bizarre as that sounds, because I always just forget about the basic things of just communications. And it's the simplest thing that makes us either win or lose business while we're talking to somebody. And it's just unbelievable how that happens. But that's the biggest thing, in my opinion, is just being able to have great conversations with people that can lead to you doing business.
No, that's awesome. And I agree with you on going back and rereading books. I was just listening to an Earl Nightingale recording. And it just reminded me that some of these basic things, you have to remind yourself, you got to write it down. And sometimes you got to listen to something or read something 4, 5, 6 times for it to really sink in. And I think that book, I remember reading that book in my 20s and, thinking to myself the same thing is, man, I got to get better at that. I got to get better at that. And every time I kind of got away from it, and I was in sales, and so every time I wanted to tell everybody everything I knew about my subject, I would always struggle. And then when I would just kind of get to know people and find out really what was important to them, and then all of a sudden it seemed like it was the easiest thing in the world.
People love talking about themselves, and if you can get people talking about themselves, they love you for no reason except that they're talking about themselves and they love themselves, and they're going to start loving you for that same reason. It's a bizarre thing. It makes no sense, but it works.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a 12-year-old granddaughter, and she lives with us and full time, and we live in an older community. So I said, I want you to start a podcast and go around to all these obviously successful people that live in this neighborhood and ask them one question. Hey, I'm going to do a podcast. I just want you, it's a one question podcast, which is, what advice would you give somebody my age if starting out at 12 years old? What advice? What's the best advice you could give me? And we're going to start doing it. Believe it or not, the dog walking business is pretty lucrative down here. So at 12 years old, she's kind of kicking it in at, sometimes $40 to walk a dog. So
a 12-year-old, I think I'm going to have to get her to do this. This is fantastic.
Yeah. And so thinking of advice, Brent, what was the best advice somebody ever gave you?
The variety of advices were, one, anything that you start at, you're probably not going to be good at it. And the only way you get good at it is by practice. When I got started in this business, as I mentioned, all that I could do was just pick up the phone and call people. And I was terrible at it, but I did it over and over and over again. I got help on it. Eventually I got good at it. Golfing, you golf. It's the most difficult thing to learn. It looks so basic, but you do it over and over and over again. And eventually you're going to get decent enough that at least you can go out and play a round of golf and not be embarrassed. Everything takes practice, and you just can't give up on anything. Investing, it's the same thing. The biggest piece of advice I got investing was start small, work your way up, make small investments at first, and they'll grow larger, and they won't feel like large investments later on. So you have to start small. But if you don't, the last piece of advice that somebody gave me was you have to get in the game. If you're not out there trying to make investments, writing offers, calling brokers, underwriting deals, you're never going to buy anything. You have to quit making excuses. I don't want to buy this deal because the market's too hot. I don't want to buy this deal because it's priced too high. You have to jump in and buy something. You have to make an investment, and you have to quit making excuses about why not. So those are really the 3 big pieces of advice that people gave me. I don't remember who gave them to me, but they're all in the book because that was really what I wanted people to know is they got to take steps to do it, and they got to get in the game.
Yeah. One thing I really love about the way, and I have the Kindle version of your book, but when I love that you put your phone number in there somewhere. I'm not sure where it's at, but you put your, I love that. I mean, that's being authentic, and it's being real. And, in today's society, that's hard to find, Brent. So tell everybody one more time how to find your book, and then and just give us the name and how to find it again one more time.
So Brent Sprenkle is the name. The book, really simple, $1 billion portfolio. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it at Barnes and Nobles. It's out there. But if you go to Amazon and punch my name in, or just put in $1 billion portfolio, it'll pop up.
Awesome. All right, Brent. Well, thank you so much for being on. And audience, as always, nothing good happens in the herd. You got to break away. Until next time, I'm Jim Oliver.